Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Amid all the talk about race in our society, one perspective has tended to get short shrift: how white Americans experience the day-to-day reality of being white. How do white Americans see themselves? That's the focus of a new online project that is part of the POV documentary film series at PBS. We will talk to the creator of that project, the filmmaker Whitney Dow, and with Michelle Fine, a social psychologist and distinguished professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, who has done extensive research on social justice issues. Guys, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
So this is called the Whiteness Project Inside the White Caucasian Box. What is that?
You know, I've wanted to do a piece on race. I've done a lot of films over the last 18 years on race. I have a black producing partner, and most of our films tended to be an oppositional construct, meaning either a victim-perpetrator construct, some event where white people had done something horrible to a black person or people. And two things happened. One, the more I thought about it, I felt like it took people who were not racist, that you could define as racist people who were killing or doing something horrible, but just everyday white people off the hook because it was events that were happening outside of them. And I wanted to do something that was non-oppositional, that had white people look at themselves and talk about their own race.
How did you get from that desire, this thing that you wanted to do, to the project itself, the way that you actually did it, these interviews which are online and interactive in which people are talking about themselves?
Well, you know, when I first had the idea, and this was a number of years ago, I sort of said I had a racial epiphany one day where I was, I was giving a talk.
I'm still waiting for mine.
I was giving a talk, and it was with a group called Facing History and Ourselves, and they structured it where these 7th graders were interviewing Marco and me about a project. And this young girl asked me, Whitney, what have you learned most about your racial identity working with Marco? And I had these sort of parallel thought processes where I was thinking, well, I don't have a racial identity. I'm Whitney Dow, you know, I'm the crusading filmmaker. And at the same time, I had this parallel thought process of, I have the most powerful racial identity in America. I'm a white male. And until that point, I hadn't really realized what an active dynamic component it was of my life. And so at that point, I wanted to try and make a film. I thought, I got to do a project around this. And I went down a lot of blind alleys because I'm a linear filmmaker. I'm a documentary filmmaker. And so I tried to make a film out of it. And I kept finding that narrative was getting in the way of content. And so as the internet sort of changed the access to interactive media, I really started thinking, well, how can I do something that's just about ideas that doesn't rely on me creating a story?
So describe what anyone who goes online to this project, describe what they'll see.
Well, when they come to the site, they'll see sort of a carousel of faces and a quote across the top with a frontmost white face. And it might say, you know, just because slavery happened, do we owe black people something? Or it might say, I feel cheated. And essentially what I was trying to do is create like an instant frame of narrative that people were in control of. They could see that there was a lot of people, and they could see this line of narrative. And then as they click on a face, it rotates, and there's another quote. So you're sort of, I wanted to give people the control of the narrative of what they were doing as rapidly as possible, and also keep them in a single frame. Then if they click on the videos, the video comes up and you can hear someone tell a 1 to 2 minute story about their own relationship to race.
I do feel a common bond with other white people because that's primarily who I find myself being around. Where I work, there is one black man of prominence in the department, of a department of, I'd say, 50 or so people closely that I work close to. I think about that a lot because being in IT, doing computer work, I'd say every job I've worked at has been primarily white, doing retail computer work, working in the medical field, IT work, really primarily heavily white. And so I think, okay, well, do I just roll in a line of work that attracts white guys primarily like myself, or is there something going on that they won't hire people of color? I don't know. It really it troubles me. And then I think, well, okay, I am social. I go out. I go downtown. I play games with friends. I'm very socially active. Why do I not hang around with or see, or why am I only primarily around white people?
And then there's a data point at the end of it. It's something that relates to what you've heard, because I'm really interested in the relationship between the qualitative experience of living in the country as a white person, meaning how you, how you experience, your most experience, and the quantitative reality of it. So I was trying to find things that both I had heard doing my work over the last 18 years that I had heard from other white people, and then also buttress it, either answer it or support it with data that we had done a lot of research to find out about sort of the quantitative aspect of it. And then it goes back, there's no autoplay, it goes back to the carousel, and you can decide again if you want to watch another video or leave or whatever.
Now, who are these people, and where'd you find them?
There are white people everywhere.
Just generic white people from anywhere. They're not from anywhere.
They're from Buffalo, New York, and this is actually the third city I've shot in. I shot it in Buffalo, I shot in Milwaukee, and each time I did the shoot, I kind of felt like I hadn't done a good job. I hadn't gotten a good representational sample of people, and I think it's, as a filmmaker, I kind of know a lot of middle-class people. We're all sort of, so when you'd go out into the world, I suddenly would get these sort of middle-class sets. So when I went to Buffalo, I really worked hard to sort of try and get, not necessarily a scientific cross-section of people, but what I thought was a representational people. I wanted old, young, male, female, white-collar, blue-collar, and we did both. I hired some people in Buffalo to help me cast it, and they used their own networks. We walked around neighborhoods and went to bars and went to places and asked people if they wanted to talk. And we also, being the modern, we used Craigslist.
Craigslist. Professor Fine,
Yes.
you watched this interactive project. What'd you think?
I did. I liked it a lot. I loved the carousel. I loved the visuals. I loved the variations of whiteness. So here's the worry. Okay, the worry is, how do people begin to understand structural racism and privilege as structural dynamics and historic dynamics in this country, and not prejudice, individual points of view. So what I love about what you've done is complicating the idea that white is a very singular identity. There are intersections with sexuality and gender and dress and clearly class. But when I speak particularly with white folks, I often have a sense that it's hard for people to see structural racism. It's hard for them to understand Ferguson as an instance of racism, rather than why was the kid walking down the street, or shame on the kid, or so for me, this is not a critique of your work at all, but mine, where I'm trying to get people to see structural and personal implications in reproducing racial hierarchy. How do we get people to understand the institutional and the structural dynamics as well as the personal ones?
Were you surprised or enlightened by anything that you heard?
What I really loved was the variations of whiteness. I grew up, my mom...
Meaning, sort of explain what that is.
Well, there was certainly a number of people who said, I didn't own slaves, so I'm not responsible for, or black men, or such and such. But there were also other people who came out of a much more of a solidarity perspective, or kind of shared interests, or people who were intersecting white with Italian, or Jewish, or gender, and I very much appreciated that. So I appreciated the complexity, because sometimes we can talk about white the way we talk about black, or Latino, or Asian, as though they are coherent categories, and in fact the kind of variation within is as important as the structural privilege that you talked about in the beginning.
Right. The easy way to talk about it is to talk via stereotypes. Whereas if you actually see people commenting on whatever, you see the different views, the different personalities, the different
And you see stereotypes. Sort of you see us all coming out of central casting a little bit too.
I actually didn't think they were particularly stereotypical. I thought the views, I thought a lot of the views that I had already heard, the views, but you're right, there was a range of views, but I didn't think of them as stereotypes. But one of the things that struck me was that I wanted more. The comments are so short. So you said they're about a minute or 2 minutes long. And race in all of its permutations is such a complex issue. And so I wonder how much insight we can get if the comments are so short. Why are they so short?
Well, this is my first venture into doing an interactive documentary project, and I was very, very concerned about the people's attention spans on the internet. Like, how long? No, I mean, I know me. If I look at it and that ticker says longer than 5 minutes, I'm like, do I really have 5 minutes to watch this thing? So I was concerned. I was really concerned about length, and this is just the beginning. This is just the first phase of this project, and it was really created as much as a proof of concept as it was to be a single thing. And I didn't realize what a big reaction I was going to get. I didn't realize I'd be sitting at this table with you 3 weeks later after launching it, and all the different the traffic and the number of Facebook shares and the different media I've been doing. It's really caught me off guard, and I feel like I kind of have opened some door, and now I want to create a national version of it where there is a lot more. Because I feel that there's a sample of 21 people here, but I like a sample of 1,000 people.
I was just going to say, didn't you feel impelled to ask follow-up questions or something like that?
Well, each interview lasted between 20 and 40 minutes, and I have sort of a series of questions that I go through, and then what I picked was I tried to pick something that I thought was representational of the interview, the representation of the people, so I wasn't misrepresenting anybody, but also representational of ideas and things that I've heard in all the different projects I've done over the years. As you said, you're someone who's covered this beat a lot over the years, and you said you didn't hear anything new. I didn't hear anything new. People say, weren't you shocked? No, I've heard all this stuff so much, but I wanted to, a lot of people haven't heard it said so directly and clearly to the camera. And also, I think when a lot of people talk about it stuff, they talk about numbers. And I really wanted to say, I've always, when I hear people talk about Iraq and they talk about numbers of deaths, those aren't numbers, those are real people, right? I mean, and I think that so much of the time, we don't connect numbers to real people. And I wanted to say, this idea that's represented in this number is also actually a real personal experience that someone is having in the world.
People have a hard time talking about privilege categories. It's hard for me to say to you, like, what's it like to be a man, or for me to say to all of us, what's it like to be able-bodied, or if you're heterosexual, what's it, right? That privilege categories we don't have a lot of words for, but our marginalized categories, we've got a more expansive grammar. But it might be interesting to catch white people at a fracture point where their privilege is called into question. And when I showed up on Staten Island at the Eric Garner march after the chokehold, there was like an unbelievable group of, it was very mixed, but the white folks were confronted with, oh my God, how is this happening over and over again around race? And what does it mean to be white on Staten Island when a man of color? Anyway, I just feel like there might be different narratives that emerge at a fracture point when the privilege is kind of either called into question or the justification of the privilege is called into question.
Well, I think that one of the fracture points that's going on right now and why people were so interested in talking is the rapidly changing demographics of the country.
Yeah, exactly.
Is a fracture point, especially for working class white people.
Exactly.
They're trying
2040 thump thump thump.
They're trying to, they're really trying to understand what's happening. When you talk about structural racism or microaggressions, you can't have that conversation with an out-of-work steelworker in Buffalo, New York.
Exactly. Right.
You'll get a microaggression in the nose, right? So how do you then bring that conversation to people who aren't privileged, someone like myself, who's like, how can I have that conversation with them? How do I bring them into the conversation? And the other thing is, how do I bring them in so they feel, A, they feel comfortable talking, and B, they're also willing to listen. And that's, I'm working on that.
One of the best parts of the project are the data points that come on screen after each comment is made. And the data points point to just how isolated African Americans are from the mainstream. So, for example, I think it's about 3/4 of whites, according to national surveys, say that they have very little interaction on any kind of social basis with African Americans. There was, in the aggregate, whites tend to think that African Americans are more racist than whites are. So these were interesting things, and this is the sort of thing that it seems to me would be very interesting to see whites discuss. So how do we get beyond these comments? You mentioned that you'd like to have about 1,000 of these, but would this be 1,000 people speaking for just a minute or two? How about a smaller number of people having a dialogue and exchange?
You know, right now, as I said, I feel like with this project, I opened a door. And I'm not sure exactly, I'm trying to be very intentional about my next move because I feel that I've accessed something and I want to, so I'm open to, like, you know, I'm not, what's
I'm
great.
urging you, I'm pushing you.
Yeah, no,
I'm
but,
nudging you.
no, but what's great about doing something that's, you know, what they call transmedia or interactive is you're no longer tied to form. And when you're a filmmaker, you're really tied to form. And it's been so freeing to be unleashed from narrative and form. And I can see this thing as a, you know, as an interactive website it is. I can see it as an installation. I can see it as a book. I can see it in so many different manifestations that I'm, you know, I guess it sounds really corny, Bob, but I really, you know, I'm trying to give other white people the same experience that I had when that little girl asked me that question.
When that little girl asked you that question, I don't believe your answer. I think you said that...
You're not the only person who doesn't believe my answers, Bob.
I think you said that you felt that you didn't have a racial identity. Now, how can you make movies about race issues, about blacks in conflict with whites, for example, and not be aware of the fact that you're white and that you asked the question online about whether whites are in a privileged position? That you had to have been aware of that.
Well, I guess maybe I'm being a little more dramatic. I guess that I didn't fully understand how dynamic and active component my racial identity was in every moment of every day of the course of my life.
You should have asked me.
I should have, well, yeah, exactly. Because yes, I'd had experiences where I'd gone and interview with Marco. I'd interview a group of black people, and I think I got this great interview, and then he'd go down and interview the same people, and I realized they've changed their names. They'd made up all these stories for me because I'm not safe to talk honestly to. I had those experiences, but again, I still felt that it was something that my force of personality superseded, as opposed, and something that I could kind of control and manage, as opposed to being able to really see myself as other people see me. And that's what I guess is sort of the racial epiphany is that recognizing that. The other thing I wanted to say, which I thought, and I'd be interested to hear what you think of this, is that something that people notice, when you ask white people about whiteness, what do they talk about? Black people. And it's fascinating over and over again when I've done these interviews. Every time I ask people about whiteness, they immediately start talking about it.
But wouldn't that always be the case if you can only be white or black, which are phony categories anyway, but you can only be white or black in connection or in opposition to the other. Without black people, there's no reason for white people to think about being white or vice versa.
I was at an Undoing Racism conference. They're really spectacular. And at one point they broke us by racial ethnic groups. So the white people sat with the white people, black people, and they said, talk about what you like about your race. The white people, it was a very dull conversation. And one woman, and the black people, we were all like envious because they seemed to have a lot of things to talk about being black. And one woman who was probably 70, she said, I guess it would be good because I could easily be a great drug mule at an airport. Nobody would like it. So I actually think more privileged groups don't know how to talk about their own category except in reference to the more marginalized group.
But you bring up a point that I think is really interesting and was really interesting in your project. there were at least 2 or 3 people who mentioned the fact that they seemed somewhat envious of African Americans having organizations through which they could express pride in being black or being African American, and then seeming to wish that there was something similar for whites. And that was said in a way, in the ones that I saw, that was said in a way that did not come across as offensive or racist or anything like that. They just seemed to want to be able to express pride in their
It's called Congress.
Race or ethnic background. But did that that apparently didn't surprise you when you saw it, because you mentioned something similar?
No, I feel like, and I feel like when I taught at University of Pennsylvania, there were always some white students who wanted to join the Black Student Association. And they were often from my tribe, Jewish young people who wanted to join because we're all people, and then they would want to run for president. So there is this kind of odd envy of marginalization, communities of color, that feels connected to the issue of privilege.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I'll ask you both the same question. Why are these issues so fraught, so difficult to talk about, often so uncomfortable if you're talking about race or ethnicity?
I think in our country it's very hard to talk about power, injustice, and structural violence. So we'll talk about prejudice, but it's very hard to talk. It's very hard to talk about privilege, and it's hard to talk about wealthy people, about their money, and it's hard to talk to white people. It's easy for them for us to talk about charity, but not justice, and what would be required to change that.
And do you accept as a given that whites in this society are in a privileged position?
I do. I certainly think there are class variations, and but I think, given skin color, white people definitely have privileges over people of color. And I live in a very racially integrated community, and my white sons can get a cab whenever they want, and my black son still has to get me to get the cab.
Whitney, you talk about why it's so difficult, or why these issues are so fraught.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for white Americans, I think Americans kind of view themselves as a force for good in the world, right? I mean, we kind of, whether how we're projecting our power around the world in the Middle East or whatever it is, and I think we have this sort of built-in tension within us, is that our sense of our own righteousness is tangled up in how this country was founded and the institutionalized and structured white supremacy and racism that the country was built on. And that's really hard to come to terms with, because you feel that you're a good person, you feel that you're a righteous person, and then you and I have this shared history, but that your and I relationship to that history is very, very, very different. So how do we find a meeting point there? I mean, I think we have, as I said, you ask white people about whiteness, they talk about black people. And I got a great letter from this woman from Albuquerque, and she wrote me and said, you know, she was a black woman, married to a white woman, and she said, it was so painful to watch these videos. And yet, when I watched them, it was really, it gave me a great sense of relief, because I always felt that my blackness was defined by whiteness. And to see that white people were struggling with the same thing, their whiteness is somehow defined by blackness. And that was a big relief for me to see.
Well, we've run out of time. Thank you both for coming. I wish you luck with the next stage of this project, and I want more. The Whiteness Project by Whitney Dow is part of a series of interactive documentaries available on the POV website at pbs.org/POV. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. One of the most disturbing stories I've read in recent years was a front-page article in the New York Times that carried the headline, "Law lets IRS seize accounts on suspicion, no crime required." It seems the IRS has been seizing the bank accounts, sometimes the life savings, of wage earners and small business owners who repeatedly made deposits that were somewhat less than $10,000. This was based on a suspicion that the account holders were trying to avoid the automatic reporting requirements triggered by deposits of $10,000 or more. In essence, what was occurring was a shocking abuse by the IRS of rules designed to catch drug traffickers and racketeers. The innocent people targeted by IRS agents had to then prove that they weren't doing anything wrong before they could get their money back. That was often a long and costly process requiring the services of an attorney. Some innocent people just gave up and lost their money. Others settled for partial reimbursement just to get the legal hassle over with. When I finished reading the article, I had to ask myself, is this America? In response to the Times article, IRS officials said they would curtail this practice and attempt to focus on activities that really were illegal. Really? Now all we need is some independent oversight to make sure they keep their word. That's all for now. See you next time.